We have no. This is the first edition of the Conférence pour le Brésil Conference. Antes de iniciarmos, lembramos que o canal também está sendo transmitido em português em nosso canal do YouTube. My name is Thomás de Barros, and I'm PhD student in political theory. I teach at Sciences Po, and I'm a member of the content curatorship at the Conference pour le Brésil. On behalf of the organizing team, I would like to thank you for your presence on Democracy Panel. This conference is organized by students and alumni of Sciences Po Paris and has its central theme as overcoming inequalities. 10 years for the Sustainable Development Goal. We will have 13 panels and more than 50 speakers distributed over 7 weeks. In addition to the tireless of the voluntary work of our team, we'd like to thank our partners from Chile Setúbal Foundation, Sciences Po Latin American Political Observatory, Educalibras, and Headline for enabling the creation of this free online event with simultaneous interpreting into English and Portuguese and Brazilian Sign Language. The theme of our conference is the overcoming of inequalities. We are going to talk about gender, race, and economic inequality. But we think it's important to create the second panel on democracy because it seems to us, and it's very clear, that democracy is fundamental to equality. Democracy is based on equality, and they are always together. They are merged with equality. It is grounded on the fact that we are all the same. We are the same within democracy. Democracy is based on equality. Even though these rights have not always been so open to everyone, it is in the name of democracy that these rights are claimed. It is the only form of society that allows this. It's the only way to claim equality and what we deserve. I'm happy to be here, and I invite 3 very important, noteworthy people for the fight on democracy in Brazil. I'm going to start with Patrícia Campos Mello. She's a journalist for the newspaper called Folha de Paulo. She's the author of a recently published book called A Máquina do Ódio, The Hate Machine. She has received several awards. If I start reading all of the awards she has received, this panel would not be enough for everything that she has been awarded. We also have the honor to receive Flávio Dino, the governor of the state of Maranhão. He has been a federal judge for more than 10 years. He was the first opposition candidate to be elected for Palácio dos Leões in São Luís. And he has also been the first governor that his party, PCdoB, elected. He actually won the election in the first round during that election. Our third panelist comes as a surprise because he speaks impeccable Portuguese. He is the executive director of the Political Observatory for Latin America and the Caribbean at Ciences. He regularly collaborates with major newspapers in the world, such as the New York Times and Le Monde, and he's a profound connoisseur of Brazil, as he has lived in this country for several years. I'm very happy to be able to moderate this panel with these three very important people, because the democracy, this theme has been in discussion with all of us. Our democracy is at risk, and for many reasons. We have a judicial system whose practices sometimes open for criticism of instrumentalization and persecution. We saw in 2018 an election in which the candidate who won had shown throughout his career, for several reasons, he has shown hostility to basic principles of democratic ethics. And we can also say that recently, all the recent attack to journalists have been receiving are frequent in this government. I would like to invite, first of all, Patrícia Campos Mello to talk to us. As I said, she's written an exceptional book called A Máquina do Ódio with the publisher Companhia das Letras, The Hate Machine. She explains and compares Brazil, India, and the United States, and she unravels how digital social media are used to spread hate speech and undermine the basis of a democratic culture. In her book, she says it very well, that the last thing a journalist would like to be is the news, him or herself. But as she tells, when she was investigating and doing her work for her book, she became a victim of that same hate machine she depicts. She has a lot to contribute in this panel, and I think, and I'd like to make a deal with all of your panelists, let's try to speak for about 8 or 10 minutes during the very first intervention. Of course, we have some margin, but that would be nice if we could stick to the proposed time of around 10 minutes, so that we can take several turns and a lot of interaction among us, and we can also include our audience in this discussion. If you are following us, whether through Facebook or Twitter, please send us your message. We have a team here working on that. So starting with you, Patrícia, I'd like to ask you, what is this hate machine that is operating or has been operating in Brazil, and how does it affect the democracy in our country? Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Thomás for being so generous when introducing me. And I'd like to thank for your invitation, Thomás, and all of the organization committee of this conference. I'm not going to be fair if I start naming everyone and forget anyone. It's an honor to talk to you with being accompanied by Flávio Dino and Gaspard Estrada. What is the hate machine? It's funny because there's this vision that the bad news comes from a bunker that is a fabrication of fake news and bad news. The efficiency of that hate machine is that it is an ecosystem that uses the social media and people who believe in that thing. When we talk about Brazil, we have the government that are turned into digital populists. They are populists just as any other period in time, but they use social media very well to communicate to their with their supporters and to eliminate the traditional media filter. And this is a dream for any politician, because the press is boring. They question and they disturb, and this is the reality today. But what is happening in the present government and in other governments that are similar to the one we have here, it's a hate scale towards the press. You want to keep your supporters in a bubble. For example, Bolsonaro government created something they call a score of life. So they'd never say the real numbers of people who died of COVID-19, but they disclose the number of victims. If you have a government that only communicates his or her its content in a very strict manner, you will probably think that Brazil has the great numbers on COVID because you're not having access to it all. So that communication strategy from those governments, we can include the Philippine government and Donald Trump and Bolsonaro. They are very similar, of course, with their own particularities. The party ruling in Poland and Turkey, for example, they all use this same sort of instrument, linking to your supporters and deviating from the traditional press. For it to work, you need to delegitimate the original press. If you see more aggressive and more personalized attacks, it is because this is the only way this popular digital leader can change the narratives. And it is easier because you're going to go against the normal journalism. And this is being more and more frequent and more personalized. And personally, we have some sorts of censorship. We say the dictatorship is, they are not the same as before. We have authoritarian regimes, and they work by using democratic tools. You don't see anything as much as the House of Parliament being shut down or anything like this. What you see is attack to journalists. You don't have a censorship role being obviously played or censoring one article here and another article there. What you have is some sort of censorship we call censorship 2.0. You don't have to ban content. With the use of social media and with the versions you'd like to make people believe, including false ones, and I'm going to give you one example. Let's talk about the COVID-19. For example, the chloroquine is a cure for COVID-19 with no scientific evidence. You bombard people with this sort of content. It's important that you have a link with part of journalists that are partners with you. Today, in the House of Representatives, what we have is what we call the Parliament of Hate. Some deputies and some secretaries or assistants feeding pages pro-Bolsonaro, and they were already very loyal followers. The deputy Carlos Bolsonaro recruited all of them for Bolsonaro's campaign, and now they are working in the government. And what that part of the parliament does is they analyze what are the objects and the narratives you are going to work with today.
So if you want to launch a defamation campaign against, for example, Felipe Neto, because he criticized the government, and if you want to spread a narrative that favors the government, they use part of this wheel that moves the hate machine use these people, target these people they want to discredit, and spread the news. So you have these accounts in the social media for the president, Jair Bolsonaro, his sons, who have millions of followers, who are very important to spread these messages. And then you have right-wing bloggers, influencers who continue to work and try to be more friendly. And then you have millions of people who believe that and organically help spread this message. So if you think that this is something very centralized, that you have some evil person moving all this, it's simply a network that is much more efficient. But for that to work, you have to attack professional uh, journalists, the professional press. So you have some fronts that attack the press. International newspapers, international press need revenues to work. They haven't figured out yet how to make money out of the internet because they don't have the means. Government goes after them for that, issuing some provisional decrees that affect their revenues. You cut all the subsidies that come from the government. You cancel all the ads for the vehicles they consider that are not patriotic. And then publicly and on the backstage, you ask your followers not to place ads on these non-patriotic vehicles. So you have all these intimidation campaigns on the internet. I don't know how you see that. Governor Flávio, Dino, and some other friends of the press have been going through that, where you have your reputation is killed online. Every time we journalists publish an investigative piece, we have to think of the consequences for us, for our family. What kind of attacks will this article bring on us? And this offensive against the press, from one on the financial side and on the personal side on the media vehicles, it works, and it has worked very well in many countries, and it's not going away soon, because these populist movements, they need to discredit the press so they can pass the messages they want to spread, this information bubbles they want to maintain. So this is a challenge for the press around the world. We have not learned yet how to cover these populist governments. We become megaphones for factoids, and they try to determine what we're going to talk about. That happens every day. For example, in the United States election, we are trying to not to repeat some mistakes made in 2016, trying not to spread conspiratorial theories. I think we need, in the press, we need to learn to be more critical without amplifying fake news from this digital populist government. I don't know if I talked too much, if I'm still in my time, but I'm going to close now, and I'm open for questions, Thomás. You've been impeccable, Patrícia. Thank you very much. It's very interesting what you said, being a megaphone for factoids. Sometimes the press becomes tied up by that, considering how the government mobilizes the media networks. You mentioned in your book that this hate speech, this hate machine, causes the citizen sometimes to lose his faith in some way in democracy and on the institutions. And I wanted to link that to something you said right in the beginning with a question to Governor Flávio Dino. Before you started in electoral policies, you had a career as a federal judge and as a professor. And you left that as your career as a judge to become a candidate. You've been elected twice as the governor, especially the last time in the first round. And you also, as a judge, criticize the institutions. And I wanted to know how much, to what extent, the Brazilian institutions are accomplices or in some way have collaborated to the operation of this hate machine that Patrícia is talking about. Hello, Thomás, and in your name to all the students, professors that organize this important conference. Thank you very much for the kind invitation and for the opportunity to learn with journalist Patrícia Campos Mello, whom I admire, and I'm a reader of her book, and Professor Gaspard Estrada. I know this debate will be very relevant. Thomás, I want to answer your question, but before highlighting to you how important this kind of debate is regarding what Patrícia just mentioned. You know that the Brazilian government currently, it lasts like for 15 days per day when the president goes to his little delimited space there and talks. Today, he dedicated his space to thinking to me, myself, and this conference we are holding now today, because for whatever reasons, he made this comment: how can someone from PCdoB be invited to talk about democracy? So I think he was publicizing our debate here. And it's a reference when everything Patrícia said is a reference for everything Patrícia said, and for what you said, Thomás, regarding the institutions that try to contain this kind of attitude, which is no doubt the role of democracy, one of the roles among anyways. Democracy is kind of the holy grail, and it's intrinsically pretentious. It has multiple scopes, multiple goals, and it's marked by utopia. And one of the roles of democracy and democratic institutions is to try to contain these authoritative impulses that are so alive in the practices of the political practices of these people. Of course, we see many gaps, as you have mentioned. But I consider that especially for what you mentioned, when you talk about a certain instrumentalization of the discredit of democracy by those who don't believe in it or that have other interests, we need to counter that state virtues and the strength of all these other spheres, like we're doing now. Before mentioning Brazil specifically, I think it is timely for us to go deeper in this issue. The success of that's happening right now. We had a coup in Bolivia that is being brought down by the popular vote. In Chile, we saw an experience that we that work with law value a lot. The original constituting power, in the sense, to the extent that a popular referendum calls for the legislative to create a new constitution. And that has just happened in Chile. We are, at least I am, expecting the result of the elections in the United States, where these terrible practices of fake news, lies, and institutionalized violence as a constant practice by the government may lose in the elections, And the Brazilian case, I think we have some reasons to celebrate, so we are not spend all your time considering that the democracy is alive in other countries, but it's alive here too. 2020 may have been one of the most complicated years in our institutional life because of all the problems we had, but in all ways we have been able to avoid a military coup in Brazil. It wasn't for the lack of a will from President Bolsonaro. He really wanted that. This is what we in penal code we call atos preparatórios. He prepared everything to implement the coup, but he wasn't able to put that into action, and he was not able to break with the democratic institutions here. Even if there is the pandemic, Brazil has been challenged and had faced all these difficulties, but everything that we managed to do was because of the strength of democracy. The role of states and cities has been extremely important to keep the numbers even at least a bit lower than what they could be. We could have had a greater number of laws if we depended on the federal government. I'd like to finish my comments talking about this thesis or my concern with analyzing all the concerns we have so we can position the way we think and our actions. I would like to mention the other side of this. We have the strength of democracy, and at the same time, you have challenges. And these challenges are still around us, inspiring debates such as the one we're having now. And just to name some, I would like to mention some of these challenges, in my opinion, this difficulties that demand our attention. One, Patrícia has already mentioned, and she is a specialist in the area, so I will not uh, even try to add that much to her observations, but I want to say that the inequalities in terms of freedom of speech or access to information, it's a very serious problem for democracy because this affects directly the elections that are the base in which democracy is developed. If you have a broader understanding for democracy, the secret universal access to the vote is essential, is fundamental for the concept of democracy. Now, fake news and the way it distorts the freedom of speech and the access to information affects that directly. The second difficulty I want to mention is the inequality regarding institutional protection. We have some people who have more freedom than the others. For example, the journalists. They are constantly under threat of moral and physical aggressions of many different types. So we have inequalities in the institutional actions of the government, and that affects all that want to protect the environment and other areas. Also, inequality in access to justice. Thomás mentioned that in his introduction. This is a situation that needs resolution. This is a problem that affects how we deal with corruption. The state is being used to protect the president. And so this reflects the inequality in the way people are treated by justice, and this violates totally what we consider democratic. And fourth, I'd like to refer to the social inequalities, of course. We know that the economical problems we have are great: inflation in food, the lack of the unemployment, and the lack of action by state governments that do not put into action some views they allegedly have. So the fact that you cannot have greater equality in spreading the riches is a serious problem. So if we had to create an agenda, for example, that we had to follow in terms of debate, thoughts, and action to protect democracy, I would make a bundle with these 5 actions. Talk about corruption, violence, access to justice, social inequalities. All these factors really hinder the concept of democracy among us. Although I reiterate that if we had to have a balance of the terrible year of 2020, I think democracy won briefly, or a very small win, but it won over despotism and the lack of information that is what we find here in Brazil. So thank you very much. Thank you, Governor. Your intervention was great.
We will be able to debate other issues in a few minutes. So before we continue, we have a lot of questions. We are receiving many questions from the audiences in the chat. But before the questions, I would like to ask Gaspard one question. Gaspard is a profound connoisseur of Brazil. And we are in Brazil. We are not in Brazil. We are in Europe. We're starting to get cold. I know he would like to be in Brazil, but there are some advantages being away, because for this reason we can see things outside the box. Considering the things that Patricia said and the fake news and how they impact democracy, and everything Flávio said, with a more optimistic point of view, with some very weak victories during this year. When we look at Brazil from France, what do we see? Wow, Thomás, it's a very good question. Of course, I'd like to thank you for the invitation for being here, and also to Patrícia Campos Mello. I am an avid reader of everything she writes. I haven't had the chance to read her book though, but I will definitely purchase it. It's harder in France, of course. And it's good to see Governor Flávio Dino today. He's in a work group on inequality, a group I coordinate with Jorge Castaneda, Carlos Ominami from Chile. I think this question is very important, because when we are inertia in the known routine, but in this dynamic it is very tiresome. And to observe this is hard for someone who is observing from Brazil. Sometimes it's important to be away to understand the tendencies and the trends, and what the trends for Brazil are worrisome, not only in Latin America but in the world. The election of Bolsonaro, just as Patricia has explained, entered a trend of social media influencing the elections. I've read several documentaries in that respect. People didn't really have as much clarity of that phenomena. And in Brazil, the use of social media is very important. In Brazil, Brazil is probably the top 5 user of, if we consider the number of users. And of course, this is an instrument that has been heavily used during the campaign in 2008. But I think it brings deterioration of political institutions in Brazil, because we don't see that in other Latin American countries. Of course, there was some political alternance from left parties to right parties, and the other way around as well at local level. But the case of Brazil has some particularities. For example, with the arrival of someone from the outside, someone who depreciates democracy and despises democracy. The case of Bolsonaro is unique, and in political science, many studies were carried out on the degradation of democracy, and a book comes to my mind, and it's not about Brazil, but it is. But the authors know the case very well. Steve Levitsky, Como as Democracias Morrem, How Democracies Die. If you ask them, they will say that the model of this institutional degradation is Brazil. And why? Because there has been a rupture of the consensus among the public of what could or could not be allowed. A friend of mine who is a friend of Steve Levitics from the University of Columbia in New York, she said to me, she told me of a story of a visit of Fernando Henrique Cardoso Foundation during the campaign of 2008. Steve Levitics presented his book, and he said the Brazilian elites shouldn't make the same mistakes the Republican Party made with Trump elections. During the preliminary, it was important that the Brazilian elites close to PSDB party did not vote for Bolsonaro because it was clear that he was in alignment with democracy values that were awkward in a sense. He even mentioned he'd love Fernando Henrique to die. That would be the trigger of a civil war. But I think that even when we are from the outside, the degradation process of the Brazilian institutions, which was solid democracy, is very clear. And this is why I share Governor Dino's optimism. And of course, with this time in which things are happening, it was paradoxically published in a conference that the president of the Supreme Court, Dias Toffoli, during that interview, he said that in 2009 there was an attempt of disruption between March and April. Not much information regarding what he wrote. I think that several coup tentatives from the government has made it clear that there is some sort of appropriation of these authoritarian regime, because many parties, which are not even considered center parties, are part of the government agenda, but the government agenda does not revolve around the fight against inflation, for example, which happened with Fernando Henrique Cardoso, or does not revolve in the ending of hunger, just like as it happened with Lula. He is just not following the 1988 constitution, and it was Bolsonaro was told this. What we call Centrão, which are the central parties, they had no political agenda that was defined, but they are adopting an authoritarian agenda now. And this is complicated because the scenario we see in the forthcoming months and years, it's not easy for the government, although it has now it's more accepted and better approved by the Brazilians, but still there is no condition this money allowance granted by the government is going to continue. maintaining such expense will make all the countries debt increase. So next year is going to be a complicated year. Although I see everything from a distance, this distance allows me to say that we should be careful. Maybe there is a third attempt from the government, an authoritarian attempt, of course, and it's probably not going to be a success for Bolsonaro. The state governments just and their role in this, just as in the government of Maranhão, so that Brazil does not have a negative income outcome with the elections this year. So thank you very much, Gaspard. I like your analysis very much, and I think we could pass it along to several questions. First of all, I'd like to ask you a few questions. Patrícia, when you describe how the hate machine operates, it's very much linked to social media. After all, do you think it is the result of the way users make use of such platforms, or do you think the platforms themselves do not make anything regarding the favoring of the creation of bubbles? So you were a connoisseur of the international scenario. Do you think there is a way to stop these bubbles from bursting? Your question is excellent. Today, there is this legislation from 1998, Section 230, regarding communication. It's an American legislation that allowed social media to exist. This considered social media just content distributors from third parties. They were not communicators, so they could not be liable for third-party contents. So if you were prosecuted due to third-party offenses, the social media would have to censor that. An activist from the Brazilian internet is grounded on this. So the platforms can only be actioned after a lawsuit is in place. The 230 Act was essential for social media so that they could prosper and grow. But after 20 years, the same social networks are oligopolies. Hate speech or polarization, for example. We know that fake news or defamation campaigns, they trigger very emotional responses, some euphoria or even hate. And this generates engagement, which are likes and shares, and this increases traffic, and it generates more data, and this is what they sell to whoever announced in those platforms. If they are not responsible for what the publication said, it is the best environment for hate speech, and it's hard to forbid them or stop them from happening. In the United States, they have a different approach in comparison to Europe regarding social media platforms. They are debating the review of Section 230. In a more radical fashion, they want to break the monopoly of social media. In Brazil, we also have the bill that is in the House of Representatives with Orlando Silva. The problem is that in Brazil, this discussion is very difficult because it's sort of binary. We have the Bolsonaro supporters and civil society and the platforms. They say that regulation of such platforms is going to stop freedom of speech. But there is another side of the story with people who want punishment. Otherwise, we're going to end up similar to the legislation of Malaysia, Singapore, because we are going to criminalize that innocent lady that shared some news on WhatsApp. So this discussion is sort of binary. I think there is a very important role carried out by the platforms. If you think of freedom of speech and why not censoring it, we are also talking the marketplace of ideas. William Douglas from the Supreme Court, he created this term. They say that the best idea will come from a market of ideas, that no censorship should be occurring. There are three fronts in the world. We are competing with someone transmitting ideas from megaphones and someone who has implanted a chip in someone's mind. There is no balance in the competition. After surpassing mediatic education, of course, it's hard to escape from some sort of regulation.
In the States, I think it's the same, but in Brazil, the people that sponsor these networks are professionals, marketing companies that are paid to launch these thousands of messages. And I think a debate on regulation on this area is extremely important and necessary. Thank you, Patricia. There is a market of ideas. I don't think using it's it's a monopoly that needs to be regulated. But if it's hard to break the bubbles, let's per se, in social media networks, I would like to ask Governor Flávio Dino what we could do to break with these bubbles in the political area. You're one of the leaders of the opposition, one of the great names in this area. And the fact that the president attacked you today, it's an indication of that. So I'd like to ask you, how can we think of ways of building bridges, not only with the the voters who elected Bolsonaro, but also in the opposition? But I think there's some narcissism of small differences. We have bubbles in the Bolsonaro supporters, but in his opponents also. What steps could we take? Is there room for us to prevent this polarization? One question we got: we have irreconcilable differences. Can we go beyond these differences? We need first to want to do that. And in my opinion, what happened, Professor Gaspard just mentioned that historically, one of the time of the election of 2018, where a majority segment of the Brazilian elite considered that it was a good idea to remove the left wing, PT, and so on, to allow for and to legitimate the arrival of Bolsonaro to the raise of Bolsonaro to the government. What I do believe in and have tried to put into effect in my practice regarding this narcissism that, as Caetano Veloso says, narcissism makes you find ugly everything that is not you. So we have to break this institution. I have dedicated myself, paradoxically, to try to create and design not only the role of the left wing, but the way we identify what we might be call the center authentically in Brazilian politics nowadays, because this is an empty space. So the question by Otávio, how can we overcome an irreconcilable society, building mediation spaces where it might be possible for the several different opinions to find legitimate places to build a middle ground where usually the right is, like the Greek philosophers used to say. When Patrícia mentions the regulation of internet, what does she complain about? The lack of a mediation. It cannot be the law of the jungle, a fight of everybody against everybody, or as you say, Thomas, the imperfect competition, and it cannot be a monopoly of the state over ideas. So how do we build mediation, the middle ground? You can only achieve that if the space of Brazilian politics is taken over again, is occupied again. So I dedicate myself to this paradox. I want the left wing to be stronger, but for it to be stronger, it is fundamental that we have something that we might call social democracy, of liberalism, moving around in Brazil. The crisis of the left wing is the crisis of the liberalism of our democracy. Above all, because when we are able to move forward in Brazil in institutional times, let's get a milestone almost universally accepted. The Constitution of 1998. What was it? It was the result of a great mediation between what at that time was the grandpa of the center, which was the constituted center. You had a position, a left that had held its positions with Ulisses Guimarães and Mário Covas, who were making the mediation between these parts. And today the gap of institutional democracy in Brazil, of political democracy, that leads to this irreconciliation is the lack of a place like this. So I have been trying to find that, but I have also tried to address the economic elites of the country, because you cannot, it's impossible to have a liberal agenda for economy living along with this type of political attitude that we have in power nowadays. So I always say to those entrepreneurs in Brazil, please be liberal. For the love of God, please be liberal. I don't want you to be socialists. I only want you to be liberal and understand that liberalism is historical. You have to be coherent in that. You cannot have this false dichotomy, the reform of this or that or whatever it is. If you fight for that, you end up accepting Bolsonaro. When I say that, they tend to agree with me. The problem is that the next day they don't identify with the institutional system and find Bolsonaro as his safe haven. So I think it's only be possible for us to break with that, with what I've been calling in the political arena, where is my place of speech, I've been called a broad front, trying to create this concept. I think only this broad concept can break the bubbles and the irreconciliation. That's why I dedicate myself to that goal all the time. How do you build an open democratic front in Brazil that comprises even a new creation of social democracy and liberalism in Brazil? If a socialist can defend liberalism, it's okay, let's do it. If there's nobody else who can do it, we are going to do it. We will defend political liberalism in Brazil. That would be a civilization advance. And this is what I've been calling a situation. It wouldn't be the first time that this idea of historical roles being taken over by different groups. And this is not something that is given to the left wing at this time. I'm sorry, Thomas. even with a great experience, long time experience from the French. That's something that has been happening in France. Even in France, making a comment, I think there's still some deeper entrenched liberalism, because every time the far right got close to the government, the Republicans built a front to stop them, and that hasn't happened in Brazil. I want to ask a question to Gaspard, made by Diogo Faria. I'm going to try to present it in a concise manner. Recently, in the last few weeks, we saw in Bolivia the win of Thomás after that rupture process. We saw this protests in Chile that started more than a year ago, and are now thinking them to writing uh, a new law. And in the United States, Trump seems to be in trouble. So we kind of see a trend around the world to maybe having future democratic fronts gaining force after a few years watching this what Patrícia called technopopulistas raising to power. Could that reach Brazil? To connect what Governor Flávio Dino said, Brazil is a very complex country with several groups. But Gaspard, do you see a possibility in Brazil of building a certain arrangement, some kind of agreement, so the opposition might be able to win? I would hope so, but to this day, what we have seen in the research opinion polls is the action of the government in health was disastrous. What we've seen in terms of fighting COVID-19, according to the opinion polls in Brazil, this policy didn't have an impact in terms of political opinion. Economy management is what has been affecting the numbers in opinion polls. And so if you don't base only in terms of the fight against COVID-19, Brazil wouldn't be the best example. But it's clear that from what we saw in the elections, especially in Bolivia, and what we are witnessing in the United States, well, of course, yes, these governments that use fake news, lies, and defamation to try to impose their political aspiration, sooner or later, they will end up losing the political fight. So as I said in my first question, I mentioned that in terms of political communication, which is my specialty, Bolsonaro has a problem. Since he's selling bread in the circus, the problem is that he needs to keep adding again and again the grotesque character of his affirmation so he can maintain this polarization. Even if he brings his tone down a little bit, every time he has a problem, he kind of snaps. And I think he screams, and I think his communication strategy will be tiresome at some point. I think he'll have difficulty maintaining this rhythm until the end of his government, especially because his government pays, although it's getting close to the center. The history of the new republic has shown that majority are built, but they are brought down quite easily. This is a specialty in Brazil regarding other countries compared to other countries in Latin America, especially because it's fragmentary character in terms of politics. And I'd like to, one thing that has surprised a lot of people who don't live in Brazil, who are not Brazilian, especially here in France, is that this party fragmentation leads people like Bolsonaro to be elected. As you mentioned properly, in 2002 and 2017, when the extreme right got to the second round in France, you had this Republican alliance to fight them. So this is what I was mentioning. As Governo Flávio Dino said, there is a consensus, at least right to this day in France, that some things cannot be accepted. In case of Brazil, the political system, the way it works and the plasticity of the political parties is so big that in the end of the day, for a candidate such as Bolsonaro, despite all this discourse, all this wish to destroy, which these are his words, wanting to destroy the democratic institutions that allow these parties to live and to prosper. Although he says that there was no Republican French, and being from another country, we are amazed at the political process and the election process in 2018. There was no action by the elites and by the process to stop that. That's why I think it's so important to build these bridges, as Governor mentioned, so there is some debate and people can move out of these bubbles.
In this particularity of Brazil. So I'd be positive in one sense. As I said, for example, the political majority, especially in the House of Representatives in Brazil, they do get formed, but they can be undone very easily. In case of Dilma Rousseff, for example, this was very clear. During the first voting session of Dilma's deposition, there were 100% of voting, and after quite some time, this started getting broken down, and all the way even in 2015. But I want to say that the political conditions Bolsonaro maintains on one side, this communication strategy, and on the other side, maintaining this coalition of political majority within the House of Representatives, I think it's going to be hard for him to get there by the end of this government in such rhythm. I think this is what that has to be built, just as Flávio Dino said, that construction of new building bridges. So getting back to Governor Flávio Dino, I think I have a question that fits to everything we are saying, and then I'm going to ask Patrícia another question again, and if we have more time, we can go for another round. But Governor, with the building bridges aspect, I don't know if he's asked. One of the persons from the audience, João Pedro, is asking, how can we break the opposition cycles when the other side does not follow the Republican game? He puts the example of the United States on the table. So we'd like to know from you. As we know, Alessandra Ocasio-Cortez, a progressist that is very famous, she has suggested the spread of the Supreme Court regarding the nomination of a very conservative judge in the United States. And in case of Brazil, if the other party does not respect the democratic game, is it possible to build bridges at all? And I'm a little skeptic about this. What is vital is the distinction between this contradiction, this main contradiction, and from that moment on, the broad front should be supported for more sustainable values, and this is what is going to mark all this construction. We have a broad front for amnesty in Brazil, for example. This also happened for the direct elections for president in Brazil, and also to have our 1988 constitutions and in constitution, any other moments in time in history for Brazil, moments that allowed successful outcomes with power alternance, of course, in the frame of democratic civilization and of values that are based on the Constitution. I do not believe pactuation is possible with Bolsonaro or the Bolsonarism. As Gaspard very specifically mentioned, he grounds on other themes. He uses another dictionary. He is some sort of permanent destruction. It's the new type of coup. It's not the coup as a Solene process. It's a processual coup. It's a day-to-day coup. It happens every day, but I'm sorry, just between quotations, it's some sort of idea of Trotsky permanent revolution. It's a permanent coup. He's not looking for anything stable. We see that within the federation, we signed an agreement on vaccination to which he agreed it on the following day. He uh, went back on what he had authorized just to generate that environment as you're fishing in very dark waters. There is no room for pactuation, even within states. He says he pays attention to Maranhão. Do you think a governor is really invited uh, for a presidential agenda being from Maranhão? Do you think he is aware of us? Do you think he is interested at all? No, he isn't. As according to what they say, and some of Patricia's friends, he's going to visit a land that is part of the state, something that is an asset of the state, but not even like that. As a government, I'm never told or informed of his visit. There is just no way to dialogue or to debate, because in the formal sense of dialogue and with the courtesy or with what the federal loyalty, as we call it, I don't believe it. I believe in one thing. For example, we had the government against Fundeb. We managed to have the majority to approve Fundeb with the basic schooling. And that encompassed even more than expected. That was against Bolsonaro's will. The emergency allowance was another aspect. If it weren't for the broad front, the poor people would have only 200 reais during that economical crisis period. So we need to find within that contradiction how that is versed in his grammar. And there are things that are not exclusively within parties, it's within social construction, and this is something we need to reflect upon. For example, it is impossible for the left party to talk about a broad front without including the church, all the churches, all religions, all of them, even though they don't agree. I have one theological point of view. I am a Catholic, and I'm close to Pope Francis, for example. Elites do not exclude me because I talk to other religious leaders in other churches. We need to find a common grammar, and we need to work on those different fronts, a mixed front, to defeat those who we cannot have any pact with. There's no pact with Bolsonaro. There's no pact with Minister of Bolivia, and there's no pact with his sons. I'm sorry, but life's like this. We have to outline the area of action for us. We need the space is outlined by the Constitution. This is the best framework, and this is what we should follow. And this is what allows us to work together towards those elections in the first or second round in the future. This is what we missed for 2018. So I end my speech just with one note, Thomas. If you don't have that broad front towards your opponent, the other party is going to do that to you. This is what Bolsonaro did, and this is how he defeated everyone. This is not a dialogue, it's an imposition. Thank you very much. Very good considerations. I remember a professor I had, he said once that the Constitution of 1988 were implemented in full if the party presented the Constitution in full, there would be comprehension in the political aspect in the country. Of course, there are some other themes that I'm receiving here that are not necessarily here, but we have several rules regarding the Constitution and how the journalism works. I'd like to ask Patricia, coming from Tanin, a journalist from Headline. He is asking if the defense of democracy also surpasses mea culpa with the Brazilian journalism. How the Brazilian journalism may have been acting for the hate machine to work. Do they play a role in that at all? So this question is for you. This is a great question from Danilo. Certainly, it surpasses that self-criticism of Brazilian journalism. I think there are some left party sectors, and they ask me why I decided not to include that in my book. I have not participated in a discussion like this, so I have not. But there are some sectors of the press. They saw the car wash operation with a lot of skepticism. Especially during the period of Dilma Rousseff. I think some of the media sectors have made mistakes there in the approach on how to cover that. And I think, just to compare, in the United States, there was a lot of self-criticism from the press, Washington Post and the Times, because in 2016, they just disclosed information and gave a lot of importance to emails from Hillary Clinton's campaign, and that took the cycle of news for weeks, and it replaced important investigations regarding Trump. There was some self-criticism there, which was good, but I think some in Brazil should happen regarding the coverage of the impeachment and of the car wash operation. Thank you, Patricia. We still have time for one last question to Gaspard or I am sorry, I'm reading. I've misled everything. Petrus Lee is asking one question to Gaspard regarding the plasticity of the institutions. Do you think they perpetuate the instability of institutions? Don't you think we are doomed to false alliances? This is the question he's asking. Well, I think it's a central point of the Brazilian institutions. And this is a place where there could be some hope. If you see what happened in Brazil since 1998, before the new republic, we'd have two parties, MB and Arena. And after that constitution, there was a multiplication of political parties, but that multiplication turned into what we call, and clearly call, this is a party mess since 2006, when the Supreme Court ended the political alliances. Today, in the House of Parliament, you have more than 30 parties that are represented in the Congress, in the Parliament. There has been an electoral reform some years ago, And this reform is going to start being effective after the elections. So this is reflecting on parties when they present candidates for mayor, because they also have to see how to include their candidates for the legislation. So what happens is that the number of parties is tending to decrease in Brazil. This party system represents a good reason for you to have hope of what I call party mass, because this is going to become more simple for management purposes, and this is going to be translated into something in the House of Representatives. If the party bureaucracy has importance in the building up of the candidacy at many levels, federal and municipal, the negotiation capacity to confirm a political majority is harder, because you are going to have a smaller number of leaderships and representatives in the House of Representatives. So if this reform happens, if it works, and if we have less parties, it is possible that in the future we may really create political majorities. And I think it's positive for Brazil, because of one of the reasons, one of the origins of all the problems of corruption and all the sort is this political fragmentation. And on the other side, it comes from that plasticity, because you have most parties that are living on party commissions. They don't have a program, they don't have an ideology, and they are just there.
And the fact that you have a smaller number of parties, I think to build coalitions, it may be positive for the country, but it depends on this reform that was thought of a few years ago really works. And we'll see the concrete translation of these initiatives already in the next municipal elections this year and the federal elections in 2022. And before going to my conclusion, I would like to ask each of the participants for a last word, about a minute. We're already running against the end of our time here. In the order I started, I would like to call Patrícia again, if she wants to make any final consideration, and then I'll pass the word to each of our participants. But I thank all of you for your participation in your speech. So Thomás, I want to really thank you for the invitation. This debate was very rich, and using the idea of the debate of this broad front, you will know much better than me, because this is happening in Europe. I think Hungary is a good example of that, because they got many parties, including the extreme right party, trying to get the current government out of place. So this might be a path for the countries to take to face these populist leaders. Thank you, Patrícia. Governor Dino, if you want to make your final considerations. I would like to end to thanking all of you again for the invitation and the opportunity to debate with Gaspard and Patrícia. Repeating the point where I based my whole participation, we are facing many threats and vulnerabilities in building our democracy, a more solidary and generous and fair society. But on the other hand, we have many lights, many headlights in our path in this journey. I think it's essential that in addition to the institutional code aspect, we have a democratic feeling. We have this warmth, nothing against the winter that is approaching us in the northern hemisphere, but I'm talking about the warmth between people. Democracy brings this. We need science, we need method, we need reflection. You in the academy practice all this, but I want to highlight this leap of faith that democracy requires and highlight these aspects of light in the middle of darkness that we'll have here, with the difficulties are there and have always been there, and they are part of our adventure in planet Earth. But I think despite this sad balance that the COVID-19 pandemic brought, we have to see or to try to predict the future, trying to measure the indicators. We'll end the year 2020 in conditions that are a bit better for our democracy than when we started in the beginning of the year, especially with the events I've mentioned. And in Brazil, we'll try to fix it and adjust here and there. Thank you very much, Governor. You can talk bad things about the European government also, but I would like to pass the word to the start of someone who's suffering with the cold weather that is approaching. That is Gaspard, for his final considerations. First, I want to thank all of you for the idea of holding this conference in Science Po, bringing so many voices to our university. I think Brazil deserves this and should be debated with plural voices, a serious debate on what's happening today in Brazil. Today, Brazil is the topic for debate all over the world, not for good reasons, which is concerning. And we didn't talk about the Amazon and deforestation and any of that, which is essential. But I think that if we have these spaces for debate, is excellent, is very good for Science Po, for the students in the university. And I think that it's important not to lose hope regarding the future of Brazil. I myself like Brazil a lot. I have lived in Brazil, as you all know, and my daily life is deeply connected to Brazil. But I think it is important that you maintain this work, be in the political arena, in the journalistical arena, in the academia, to be able to defend your country. And as we when we talked about Mexico, things may change for Bolsonaro because the international scenario is changing. And if there is some change in the next few weeks, I think we'll have after the election in the United States, of course, the international scenario for Bolsonaro will be more complicated. He will be in a more isolated international position. And we've seen some practical experience of that. And the graduation at Rio Branco, where Chancellor mentioned that Brazil is already a pariah internationally, talking openly about this possibility. So I think the scenario for Brazil with regards to foreign policy will be more complicated. The worst would be for Brazil to be locked out. Brazil has local, city and state governments that want to be active. The French government wanted to insisted on calling many governors from Brazil to debate the issue of deforestation. And I think this thought needs to be brought to the students. And I think this is how I want to complete and end my talk. Can I say something, Thomás, quickly? Thomás, just to remind you that Mr. Ernesto Araújo, he said he was proud to be a pariah next to the United States in the defense of freedom. So if Trump loses now, it will be hard to be a pariah without the support of the United States. Exactly. You will just be a pariah. Thank you, Patrícia. Thank you very much, Gaspard. I really have to close because we have our time here. I love this debate. I just want to remind all our audience that next Saturday we have the third panel of Conférence pour le Brésil that will debate elections and institutions. We have the former candidate to President Fernando Haddad, Nina Fernandes dos Santos, who is from Bahia, and economist Cláudio Ferraz. I want to invite all of you to continue following us in the social media. We'll continue debating the goals for the